Thank you, Jessica, so much. We're going to keep this going, and we're going to keep the energy high, and we're going to continue to challenge you to think about this place, Detroit. I want to also thank the Planning Committee, thank the board and the staff of GIA. It is so good to see y'all in Detroit. It's so good. But for now, I'm going to turn our attention to our keynote, and it's an honor to introduce Maurice Cox. He's not your ordinary planner. He really isn't. He's not your ordinary planning director. I mean, if you really think about it, he's been at GIA and a part of the GIA family for quite some time. An innovative thinker that really tries to push the envelope, whether he is in the classroom as a design educator and an architectural educator, or as an urban planner, or as the former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia. Keeping the energy high, Maurice Cox.
All right, good afternoon. So you just had the keynote. That was Jessica Moore. I could have kept listening to you for another 20 minutes. Thank you all so much for, I think they're going to get me up on the screen. Thank you so much for coming to Detroit. You come at an incredibly important time in the urban history of this city. Just in a nick of time. I really think that Detroit is ground zero for the transformation of an American city, and I am thrilled that I get to be a part of this. So I'm going to try to frame to you a little bit about the spirit of Detroit and the role that arts and culture has played in anchoring this recovery. And how we are trying to reframe this conversation as a conversation about neighborhoods. So there's a notion that placemaking is something that is brought to you by great institutions that have been there and anchored places. But it's also about creating new places, in many instances out of mere asphalt. The recovery and the creation of this pop-up Spirit of Detroit Plaza was meant to bring the neighborhoods to the very center, at the very front door of City Hall. And while we know and understand that urban recoveries are anchored in their downtown, right? There's only one downtown, so recoveries begin there. That's the heart of the city. But really, the soul of any city is found in its neighborhoods. And that is the historic pivot that we are embarking on in Detroit. But I come to this question about culture and place through the history of my career of working with culture producers in place. Sometimes they're in rural places, sometimes they're in urban, but they're always challenged because very often they're in places that are marginal, that people have forgotten about. So I'm going to quickly take you through three examples. One in rural Virginia in Bayview, which was a project that I worked on for 6 years with a group of residents that were precariously housed in a rural land, and working with them to try to understand how you could reimagine that community and at the same time preserve their rural character. And I would argue that over the course of those 6 years, they went from being passive observers to people who owned the land that they developed on, and to this day, they now manage a community of about 200 homes that they built. And that has produced a level of resiliency that even to this day has helped them to solidify their claim to that place. When I went to New Orleans and was asked to be a part of this book that says, well, you read it, "We're Still Here, You Bastards," it was a confirmation of the idea of Black culture and how you begin to preserve it, what it looks like. So the Dewdrop Inn, so famous in New Orleans that Little Richard wrote a song about it, was really a kind of ramshackled group of houses on LaSalle, a place where jazz and music greats from the beginning came and frequented. Ray Charles slept there. And how do you take those buildings and infuse it with meaning so people can understand the rich culture that existed there? And how do you invent new programs to reactivate that through the arts? But in the meantime, acknowledge that this is not blight, this is culture. And is there a way, even as it awaits its capital investment to be reinvented, to get it off the blight list and move it into the cultural column? And then a project that is very, very dear to me, my work with the Tulane City Center, the Mardi Gras Indian, and their council. Some of you may know of this rich cultural heritage of African American men who get together as a group and sew these elaborate suits in competition with other tribes. And so Chief Howard Miller there in the center is transformed in 2 weeks of the year of a suit that he's been working on all year, disassembles it, and starts again every year. And how you can build cultural institutions around this incredible craft, and how you pass that on to other generations. So the question that they posed to me was, how does the Mardi Gras Indian group build cultural institutions? And through the work of partnering with design professionals, creating these neighborhood-based cultural centers that have a big porch for performances, but inside can actually exhibit their suits. How do you take it from a single building process to an entire district strategy? So taking the LaSalle corridor, which is the center of their parading, and turn it into a community economic development opportunity by these culture bearers. And so what you're looking at is an assessment of all of the properties that the Mardi Gras Indian Cultural Council were encouraged to purchase so that they could claim LaSalle corridor as their own. And it started with one single double shotgun being the anchor to their cultural campus. We wrote that grant together, an Art Place grant, and they were able to buy the entire block and begin to establish their permanent presence on LaSalle. So let me come to Detroit and why Detroit matters and why arts and culture in Detroit matters. There's a scale of Detroit which is quite impressionable, 139 square miles. That's big. There are over 200 neighborhoods in this city. Over 24 square miles of land is under a single ownership. So imagine the force to transform with those kinds of assets. and how you take those unique assets that are embedded in neighborhoods and use it as an opportunity to revitalize neighborhoods. So that's the vision for PDD, the Planning and Development Department that I direct. How you can build a city that's secure in its future, and that's saying a lot in Detroit, to be secure about the future, grounded in its roots, which ultimately speaks to our collective culture, and then hopeful, not in the future, but hopeful right now in the present state. And for me, that gets into the question of placekeeping, and how through the arts we can promote cultural preservation and a kind of social interaction. This is coming from a chapter in urban history that's vitally important, because African American neighborhoods have historically been subject to urban renewal and urban removal. So something like Paradise Valley in Black Bottom, where that thrived, culture and arts and entertainment thrived there, has disappeared, right? And so what we are left with are fragments of that culture that can be held onto and reimagined, like this collection of arts and entertainment venues that are being imagined through Harmony Park in the center. So part of it is trying to hold on to those fragments, infuse them with a new generation of development, but also lifting up our iconic heroes like Joe Louis. Just 2 days ago, the Mayor Duggan named the Inner Circle Greenway, which will be a 26-mile loop around the city after this cultural icon. And what it means to take one of our heroes and use that person to unite a city in its entirety and create a venue through which every neighborhood can identify itself with this iconic figure. The other are well-known and established exports of culture, like Motown, and helping that institution to grow in place. And remember that it was these modest two homes tied together by a breezeway that revolutionized American sound. And how then do you support their growth in place and give them not just the capital to build a flagship music institution, but to build an entire district around them so that there's the support for them to thrive. But not everything is a Motown, right? Culture in Detroit is indigenous, it's spread out, it's in all places. And I just want to lift up 3 protagonists of many in Detroit that have embedded in their mission the ability to anchor communities and continue to produce culture. Of course, techno was invented in Detroit by these 3 gentlemen and has gone worldwide. It supports a music fest, but they still reside in a very modest commercial structure on East Grand. And the museum that they aspire to make is really just kind of pulled together. There are no major cultural financial resources being directed their way. Imagine what they would do with that level of support. Or the African Bead Museum, an extraordinary example of local culture in place. And what's interesting is, so this is the current state, right? The roof of their structure has collapsed on itself. So is this culture or blight? In some instances, people would say, well, this is the building to be demolished. But if you pair those culture producers with the professional technical expertise that they need, they can be reinvented in place, like this proposal to reimagine the Bead Museum, accepting the roof has collapsed and creating an open air courtyard so that culture can be stay in place and become the anchor for a larger reimagining of that that part of town. Or the Oakland Avenue Farm, this extraordinary project of urban ag that produces culture, produces jam, and it's Afro Jam. So they are partnered with a graphic designer. They're partnered with a group of architects that have taken their concepts and given it shape and form. So we're looking at a multi-million-dollar enterprise. So what are the resources that have to be brought to allow them to stay in place and to prosper? Or the Heidelberg Project. And I was introduced to the Heidelberg Project, way back in 2005 when we gave them an Urban Design Award for their ability to interpret a place, even on the margins. And how do you take this from a controversial, antagonistic relationship between government and the arts and forge a partnership instead that allows them to evolve into the next phase of their development? And so the Heidelberg Project and the Planning Office have entered into an unprecedented memorandum of understanding in which we are going to lift them up and allow them to evolve as an anchor arts and culture institution in place. There are other notions of how we can support the arts, and I think of Sam White and Shakespeare in Detroit, a roaming theater company that doesn't have a home. And is it possible to take those economic development frameworks that the city is advancing and graft arts and culture onto every one of them? So if we have a plan for the East Riverfront framework, which is a multi-million square foot development with discrete projects in it, can you take a building like the Stone Soap building, which is an opportunity to preserve the heritage, the industrial heritage of the riverfront, and wed that with the developer, who then finds a home and a place for Shakespeare in Detroit, anchoring that site of a mixed-use development? Or if you move in far out into the outskirts of Detroit, like Northwest Grand River, and the planning frameworks that we are now undertaking with residents, finding a way to anchor arts and culture into the comprehensive strategy for neighborhood revitalization. So in the case of Grand River, there's the Old Redford section. They have an annual sidewalk festival. They have the Artist Village, which is this incredible courtyard embedded in the middle of the block. How do you use this as the anchor of a neighborhood-wide strategy? Well, it starts by having conversation and meeting people where they are, and lifting up those aspects of their neighborhoods that have true meaning, and allow them then to use that as a means for economic community development. So here's the strategy. Take the Artist Village, which is at the core of the Old Redford downtown, and create a framework by which that art can enter into the neighborhood and become the anchor of multiple programs. So the rehabilitation of the elementary school, not just housing, but would house arts organizations interspersed in that residential development. And the space, the grounds of the Holcomb School can become an art park that would allow the artist village to now emanate into the neighborhood. And let's go a couple of steps further. The regional parks, which are in the area, is there a way to infuse those as a continuum from the center to the school to the regional park of River Rouge? And so this is how I think one neighborhood might do it. There are other neighborhoods like West Verner in Southwest, where the Latino community anchors that area. Is there a way to talk about the way the Latinos gather, a kind of Latino urbanism, which is about squares and public spaces? Is there a way to take their cultural traditions and embed them into public space, into the public realm? So a street like Bagley might just be a street, but it also might be a festival grounds, just in how you configure the public realm. Or Clark Park might be a park, but it also might be a gateway or a plaza that again lifts up the cultural heritage of that particular people in place. So to do this work, sometimes you have to form alliances and allegiances and partnerships with unlikely players. And could we imagine a place in community where residents could find each other, resources could be allocated, and they could in turn inform the designing planning process? This one sentence quote allowed us to get a grant through Kresge to forge a neighborhood home base, which would be that place where all of those players could come together in the neighborhood and be the ground zero for reimagining this neighborhood. So what has happened, and we hope to be open in February, a single place in a neighborhood where the planning director, the developers that you see at the top of the slide, Century Partners, the block clubs, which are citizen anchors in that neighborhood, Live Six Alliance, a nonprofit, and the University of Detroit Mercy, DCDC, all coexisting in the same space. And how do you take that idea, and for every neighborhood strategy, you develop one of these design centers in a box? And so what's fascinating about this, with that one single phrase of what we were trying to do with these design centers in a box, we won the Night City Challenge. There was no budget. There was no long, drawn-out description. It was just an idea, and they funded it. And this will allow us to create those places where folks can come together and begin to maximize the potential of local neighborhood culture to be the new identity of those areas. So this is the beginning of our journey in how we can embed arts and culture into everything we do, how we can graft it on to the city's aspirations for revitalizing neighborhoods, how we can find a way to lift up those organizations in their place where they have authentically produced that culture as a comprehensive strategy for reimagining the city of Detroit. And with that, I thank you, and I hope you're inspired by what we are trying to do here. Thank you.